Our current course unit is all about arguments, and by this, I don't mean heated disputes or lovers' quarrels. In philosophy, an argument is essentially a method of putting positions forward by offering justifications for those positions. A good philosopher will not make a case for an idea without supplying reasons for it, and it may be said that we ought not accept a philosophical idea without carefully considering the reasons for the idea. We typically dissect arguments into two parts: the conclusion, which is the main idea being argued for, and the premises, which offer the evidence or justification for the main idea. You will find that philosophers often number their premises and draw a line between an argument's last premise and its conclusion. Conclusions are denoted by the words thus, so, therefore, etc. Take as an example the following argument. Premise 1. All streaming services are media companies. Premise 2. Netflix is a streaming service. Therefore, Netflix is a media company. This argument is valid. Why? Because if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. That is to say, an argument is valid when, if the premises are true, it is impossible that the conclusion is false. In an invalid argument, it is actually possible to have a false conclusion and true premises. Note that this does not mean that the premises have to actually be true, only that if they were true, the conclusion would follow necessarily. Validity is all or nothing. Deductive arguments are either valid or not valid. Validity does not come in degrees. Think of validity as being about the relationship between premises and their conclusion. Take another example. Premise 1. All streaming services are petting zoos. Premise 2. Netflix is a streaming service. Therefore, Netflix is a petting zoo. This argument is valid, even though the first premise is not true. However, if it were true that all streaming services were petting zoos, and if it were true that Netflix is a streaming service, then the conclusion must be that Netflix is a petting zoo. Now here is an example of an invalid argument. Premise 1. All streaming services are media companies. Premise 2. Netflix is a media company, therefore Netflix is a streaming service. This argument may appear to be valid, given that the premises and conclusion are all true. However, the point is that the conclusion does not follow necessarily from the premises. Where does this argument go wrong? Look at the first premise, which tells us that anything that is a streaming service is a media company. It does not tell us that anything that is a media company is a streaming service. So it leaves open the possibility that there are media companies that are not streaming services. So, when the second premise asserts that Netflix is a media company, the conclusion that they are thus a streaming service as well is not guaranteed. So this argument cannot be valid. Next, let's distinguish between legalization and decriminalization. Many people use these two terms interchangeably, but that's not really accurate. While legalization may be considered a type of decriminalization, decriminalizing a drug is not the same as legalizing it. The term decriminalization itself is often misleading. To decriminalize a drug is to essentially decrease the criminal penalties associated with some instances of possession. Sometimes this is done by reducing the punishment from a criminal offense to a civil infraction similar to a traffic ticket. Decriminalizing LSD, for instance, does not mean that citizens are allowed to possess as much LSD as they like, but typically that only small amounts of LSD are not punishable with long periods in jail. A person caught with a small amount of LSD in a state which has decriminalized that drug may still be fined or jailed, but such punishment is less severe than what was previously handed down. This, of course, varies state by state and city by city. To legalize a drug also does not mean that citizens are allowed to possess any amount of the drug in question. Colorado, for instance, has possession limits on cannabis for all adults over the age of 21. It is not legal to walk the streets of Denver with a pound of cannabis on your person. The main difference between legalization and decriminalization that is important for our purposes in this class has to do with a well-regulated market. In a decriminalized system, though it may not be a criminal offense to possess a small amount of a certain drug, it is still criminal to manufacture or distribute the drug. In a legalized system, it is lawful for licensed individuals to manufacture and distribute the legalized drug. In a decriminalized system, an underground market provides drugs to the drug users. Those who advocate for legalization claim that the harm associated with drug use would be reduced given that production and distribution are overseen by the government. To be clear, the claim is not that cocaine and heroin are good for people to do recreationally, but that their use would be less harmful if government agencies regulated their production rather than an underground market. While our last video briefly discussed the legalization of cannabis, most of the articles for this unit discuss the legalization of drugs more broadly. While there currently seems to be broad support for legalizing cannabis in the United States, what about cocaine, methamphetamine, or heroin? What is the best way for our society to approach the use of those drugs? Here is a brief overview of the readings for this unit. Douglas Husak. His article argues for the decriminalization of drugs, while admitting that the term decriminalization is difficult to pin down. In particular, pay attention to his notion of criminalization. George Schur. His article claims that while penalties for cannabis possession are clearly too harsh, our society ought to continue with criminalization of other drugs. He provides 3 arguments in favor for criminalization and takes direct aim at Husak's ideas. Michael Humer. Humer is a well-known libertarian philosopher who argues for legalization of all drugs. While this immediately strikes many people as irrational and dangerous, please note his emphasis on personal liberty. Also, his writing style is pretty hilarious. Timothy Hsiao. This article is very interesting because Hsiao is going against the majority opinion in our society. Hsiao is arguing that cannabis should not be legalized, and he does so while trying to appeal to personal liberty like Humer does as well. Even if you disagree with his article, please note how he strives to be philosophically consistent, especially when it comes to the issue of alcohol prohibition. Paul Smith's article proceeds by looking at several arguments for prohibition and critiquing them. Please pay special attention to his treatment of the Kantian argument against drug use, and note that this particular argument is not arguing for or against legalization or decriminalization, but only that drug use is immoral. The end of his article provides a lengthy and robust argument against prohibition. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to reading your discussion post this week.